And welcome to the Road from Emmaus podcast. I'm your co-host, Ron Morgan, along with fellow co-host Kit Colver. Our goal for each episode each week is to take you on a guided tour of redemptive history, showcasing the beauty, splendor, and unity of God's amazing story of cosmic redemption, restoration, and renewal. We hope that our conversational tone and format make an unfamiliar topic for many and intimidating for some more approachable, accessible, and digestible unto growing and edifying the body. This is the fourth episode in our Journey from the Scriptures series, Journey through the Scriptures series. For those new to the podcast, our discussion format each week will be to respond to the discussion questions embedded at the bottom of the study notes document. You can find this linked in the podcast description box. In the same box, you'll also find a link to our website, roadfromemmaus.com, where we share a bit more about ourselves, how we got the podcast name, and provide several helpful resources to help you dig further into redemptive history, no matter where you are on this journey. From time to time, Kit and I will also respond to direct questions listeners pose, such as yourselves, that fit a current topic. You can reach us at contact@roadfromemmaus.com. That's contact@roadfromemmaus.com. Before we jump in, make sure you subscribe to our YouTube podcast so that you can receive notifications for fresh content. We will drop a new episode every Monday morning, so we look forward to you taking this exciting ride through the scriptures with us. Hopefully you were with us last week where we really talked about creation and crisis, and we introduced some very hopefully interesting ideas, concepts. One of the things that we really wanted to stamp is just the importance of understanding and viewing the Bible, especially the creation account, from this functional perspective, and the fact that many of these threads, whether it's kingdom, whether it's temple building, etc., really the first and the creation will not be the only time you see those. So it's important that we're able to not only connect to those later on as we build out scripture, but that we understand how those things evolve and pivot while still keeping their core essence, if that makes sense. To that end, one of the things that we wanted to start our conversation with today is the following. In what ways does man serve as both appointed monarch or king and mediator priest in the garden sanctuary? And then, Kit, how does recognizing and rightly understanding these dynamic roles provide the necessary context for accurately assessing the two trees that we talked about quite a bit at the end of the last episode as standing in the midst of the garden?
Well, we know that chapter 3 of Genesis comes after chapters 1 and 2, and recognizing that the Bible is building a case, telling its story, building on itself, we should expect, just as a matter of kind of basic understanding, that we're going to be interpreting the calamity of chapter 3 through the lens of chapters 1 and 2. And what we see in chapters 1 and 2 is that man is created, as we talked last time, as the image and likeness of God. He is image bearer for the sake of being image son, sonship being a relational idea. And you see that in chapter 2, where God takes the man and he puts him in the garden that God has established for his own dwelling place. So the man is now there with God in God's sanctuary space, and he is charged with keeping the garden. And we tend to think through, again, our lens, okay, well, he's got to be out there with this hoe and getting the weeds out of there and pruning the flowers. And that's not the idea. It's the idea of care and stewardship, administering God's own presence and loving lordship in the world. So that's the regal and the priestly idea. Man is the one who is Lord of the lords. He is the one who rules over the fish of the sea and the birds of the sky and the beasts of the field. He is the one who is Lord over God's works, but as administering God's lordship. So he has a mediatorial role. He doesn't rule in his own right. He doesn't rule in his own authority. He is, as it were, God on behalf of the creation. So he brings the rule of God to bear in the world. And then from the other side, he is the one who bears back to God the creation's relationship with God himself. He serves that mediatorial role. That's what we see happening in Genesis 1 and 2. And that function of man, that role of man, is the way in which we have to understand these two trees. As we said last time, God puts the man in the garden where that is his own sanctuary, and in the midst of that garden are these two trees, a tree of life and a tree of the knowledge of good and evil. So whatever those things represent in relation to man, in relation to man's interaction with them, that all has to be seen through the lens of, again, who man is, his presence with God, his role in God's purposes for his creation.
Kit, much is bound up in God's instruction for man to eat freely from the tree of life. What insight does this counsel provide regarding the intended design and purpose of the divine human relationship beyond our biological existence, right? Beyond taking in oxygen too, which I think a lot of people equate with this idea of life.
Right. Well, I mean, like I said, the fact that this tree sits in the midst of the garden means that it plays some kind of vital role in this concept of sacred space and the divine human relationship that take place in that space, in that garden, God's garden sanctuary. So I think the point at bottom is that relationship, that intimacy, that functional work of man in relation to God, man's fulfillment, as it were, of his own sonship, is somehow bound up in this principle of life associated with this tree. Man is to not just, okay, you can eat of this tree if you want, but he is to be continually consuming from this tree. This is to be at the center of how he carries out his existence in relation to who he is and what God has mandated him to be. So I think fundamentally what we see is that man was created for this intimacy with God as Lord on God's behalf in the world. And in order to do that, he has to participate in God's own life. When man is created, he is stated to be dust from the ground. The text doesn't say he was made from the dust of the ground. We want to read it that way, and then we think, oh, okay, well, the idea here is, what's in the ground? Well, all of these elements, metal elements and various kinds of constituent physical compounds or whatever. And so man, it has all of that in his body. His physiology very much corresponds to the kinds of elements and compounds that we see in the dirt. And he's not made from the dust of the ground. He's made dust from the ground. And that idea biblically, we won't develop that all out today, but biblically, it speaks to the fact of man's mortality, man's frailty. Man is dust. God remembers our frame. He knows that we are dust. And so the idea is man's frailty, his non-ultimacy. Man is created in that sort of a way. Well, how is that addressed? It's by him continually partaking in this life that's associated with God, this thing called the tree of life. Man is created to become and to be man indeed by sharing in, perpetually depending on, drawing upon God's life as image son. That's the idea that's being expressed there.
And Kit, like I love the idea of non-ultimacy, which may not be familiar for our listeners, but we even see that just even in terms of his vice or deputy capacity that he is appointed by God too, that he is not only God unto the creation, but he is to reflect the creation back to God faithfully as son. Kit, I'm wondering too, to our natural, maybe modern sensibilities, the idea of being non-ultimate or interdependent kind of ruffles our feathers. It kind of chafes us. Help us maybe frame that from a biblical perspective for why being non-ultimate actually is not perceived as being inferior or insufficient, because I think our natural sensibilities may say otherwise.
Yeah, I think, as you say, just from our standpoint of our sense of ourselves and our significance, the idea that somehow I would have my own ultimacy in something or someone beyond myself. As we'll see, even as we deal with this thing of the fall, that was a part of this deception, is that man can be, a human being can be truly, fully, consummately human in and of himself, apart from anything else or any other input or any other relationship. And so we have this kind of sense of I'm me and there's me and not me, and and in myself I'm complete and I'm whole, regardless of anything outside of myself. But there's also the philosophical and the religious aspect of this, which is non-ultimacy as kind of pushing back against this idea of the immortality of the soul. And, I don't want to go far down that road today. We'll deal with these things later on. But so many in Western culture, and this has been a part of Christian culture for a long time, we start from the premise of the inherent immortality of the soul. And that's why we have this idea that, somehow the soul's going to go someplace. It's going to go to heaven or it's going to go to hell. But when we die, our soul is released and it lives forever. It's an immortal soul, so it has to go somewhere. And ultimately, this idea, which comes from pre-Christian Greek thinking, the immortality of the soul and the way that we think of it actually argues against the biblical principle of the resurrection of the dead. Resurrection as pertaining to the inner man and the outer man, the bringing life out of death that pertains to the soul, the inner man, as much as to the outer man. And so that's another reason that we kind of chafe at this idea of non-ultimacy, is we say, well, wait a minute, my soul endures forever, it's eternal. And so what do you mean I have to somehow, in a sense, draw on this thing called life from God, because my soul's going to live on no matter what, one way or the other.
Indeed. Why does partaking of the tree of knowledge of good and evil immediately and automatically exclude man from the tree of life? And I guess, Kit, too, one of the things we've even heard in Sunday school is so many people are focusing more on the act itself. And so maybe even speak to that, and just maybe even how preconceived notions or assumptions that we bring to the text may actually be clouding our perception of what is actually taking place there.
Well, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil is set in contrast to, as I mentioned last time, whatever it means what it means somehow in relation to the tree of life. And together they mean what they mean in relation to man's created identity and function in his presence in the midst of this garden, serving God's purposes in the world. But what we see with the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, as I mentioned last time, is that there's an antithesis in this, such that partaking in the one precludes the other. God says, eat freely of the tree of life, but don't touch or don't eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And if you eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, then this thing called death will result, antithetical to partaking in life, from the tree of life. And so eating of the tree of knowledge of good and evil will preclude eating from the tree of life, and vice versa. That tree threatened the condition, as it were, symbolized by the tree of life. Eating of it would incur the sentence of death. In that sense, man being dust from the ground, it would bring about perpetual mortality, exclusion from the tree of life. And ultimately, the choice concerning the tree of the knowledge of good and evil would determine human destiny. It's not just a matter of breaking a commandment. We talked last time about the covenant of works idea, and okay, God gave a commandment, don't do this, and Adam did that, and he broke this commandment. Well, it's not just about some commandment that God issues. It's about a way of approaching human existence that will bring about a calamity called death that becomes the whole human destiny. It's that sort of an issue.
And so I think even what I'm hearing, Kit, and just to even stamp this is that when we think about these things, we need to be thinking about it more from a philosophical perspective and just even a worldview that we're embracing, not just a behavior or an act that is taking place too. As we wrestle with that, Kit, too, and one of our final questions that we want to unpack is the creation account reveals that autonomous wisdom, which we're going to talk about more over the next couple of minutes, is human wisdom that is self-derived, self-referencing, self-assessed, and ultimately self-serving, results in man's death, as you've already alluded to, not as divine punishment, but as inherent consequence. How then should this death be understood? And what we're talking about is man's violation of his identity, calling, purpose, and thus forfeiture of his humanity. Can you speak to that a little bit, Kit?
Sure. Well, again, the text says that in the day you eat of it, you will die. It doesn't say in the day that you eat of it, I will kill you because you've broken my commandment. And so this thing of death is treated as the inherent outcome of eating of the tree of life, or I'm sorry, of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Well, we say, okay, well, that's the problem, is that God doesn't want people to know good and evil. And as you said, basically, this idea of knowing good and evil is this concept of wisdom, being able to judge things for what they are. And we say, and I've heard people say this, well, God doesn't want people to have that sort of capacity or to have that discernment. That belongs to him. He doesn't want that. And you see that even in the Genesis 3 account, God says the man has become like one of us, knowing good and evil. So, God has the knowledge of good and evil. He doesn't want people to have that. Well, that's really not the case. Man's role as image son, man is to be God in the world. Man was created to possess the wisdom, the judgment that God has, but as possessing that through intimate union with God himself. In other words, he becomes a sharer in the divine wisdom, the mind and the understanding and insight and heart of God by sharing in God's own life, not autonomously. And what we see being depicted in Genesis 3 is the seduction that human beings can attain or obtain the wisdom that we all seek. Man was created for wisdom, if you will, but it's the seduction that we can become wise. We can have the capacity to think and act and judge according to what is true or proper or right or wrong, in and of ourselves autonomously, as opposed to being an extension of God's wisdom, an extension of his mind, administering his heart, his will, and this is what, again, we see even in Jesus when he says, my words are not my own. My actions are not my own. As the Father speaks, so I speak.
Mhm.
As the Father judges, so I judge. My food is to do the will of him who sent me, right? That's the human vocation, is to be the administrators or administrators of God's own wisdom. And what's being depicted there is the human quest for independent, autonomous wisdom. And what that brings is the attainment of a wisdom, but a false wisdom, a wisdom that's set in the context of alienation from the life of God, and therefore a pseudo wisdom that only brings about death. It only undoes the shalom and the harmony and the goodness, the propriety of God's creation.
Yeah, I don't think you're going to see T-shirts with "ultimacy is interdependence," Kit, anytime soon. Right, too. And with that, Kit, it makes me think of just even some modern examples of this, and I'd love for you to build on it as well. But even especially in our American culture, maybe not so much in other ones, and I think certainly probably not so much in Hebrew culture as well, or Israelite culture. Just this idea of pulling yourself up by your own bootstraps, right? Just almost just like the braggadociousness or the arrogance or the pride in just not only being individualistic, but that I did this totally by myself, right? Without any
Right.
support. And oftentimes that's not even an accurate assessment there too. Kid, as you reflect just even in your own engagement and just obviously you're swimming in this is your cultural river as well too. What are some maybe modern examples, societal examples that you can think of that really test to the manifestation of this idea of autonomous wisdom and just the deep deception that exists behind it as well?
Well, I think at bottom, we have to say that the fundamental um, error or the fundamental malady that defines human existence is this thing called idolatry. And we say, well, I'm not an idolater. I don't build little statues and I don't worship Baal or whatever it happens to be. But idolatry just speaks to this idea of a God that is not the true and living God, giving ourselves to worshiping, serving a God that is not God. And the fundamental idol that defines every human being is self. And so we say, well, wait a minute, I'm not an idolater. I believe in the God of the Bible. Okay, well, maybe we do, maybe we don't. But what idolatry makes us do is devise that God, form him in our own image and likeness in a self-serving way. I think we've talked before about the depiction in kind of a mocking way in Isaiah the prophet, where the foolishness of people taking a piece of wood and part of it they burn in the fire to warm themselves and to cook their food, and then the other part they carve into an image and they fall down before it and they say, "You are my God, deliver me." And in both instances, whether they're warming themselves or feeding themselves, the wood is serving their perceived good, their perceived benefit, or
Mhm.
carving an image and falling down and saying, deliver me, you're my God. This is what idolatry does. And so even in our religiosity, even in our spirituality, we're devising and forming conceptions of powers and forces and deities that really will serve our interest. And I think an easy way that we see it is people will say, well, how can there be evil in the world? How can there be death in the world? How can there be suffering in the world if there's a good God? If there is a God, then he needs to be, and they fill in the blank. If God is good, then my child wouldn't get cancer. If God is love, then there wouldn't be a Hitler in the world. And it's us again setting ourselves up. It's the Genesis 3 idea. We set ourselves up as the ultimate arbiter. We make ourselves God. We think and act and judge and conclude out from ourselves, making God even subject to our own speculations and our own notions. And there are a million ways that we see that operative in the world, because this is just what human beings do. Even when they're religious, their conceptions of deity and spirituality are ultimately self-conceived and self-serving.
Well, okay, we've even talked about this idea too, that religion at its core is mediated distance. And
Yeah,
that I think even what I've come to see too, even in my own just growth and walk too, is not just mediated distance, but man defines the distance. He also defines the engagement, as you've said. So even as he encounters God, and we've talked about that idea of sanctuary, the divine human encounter, that man not only defines what that sanctuary will look like and what God will look like on the other end, but what that encounter will look like and how and to your point, Kit,
exactly.
how it will be self-serving and affirming unto himself too. And if I don't like it, Kit, it's very easy to swap out idols and put in something else that is now to my greater benefit.
Right, right. We like God being distant, but we just want a lifeline to him.
Yes.
And it is that idea of managed distance. So it's just the way that we naturally think, and we are ultimate in and of ourselves, and God becomes the servant of our own ultimacy. God is just the three letters God, and it's a word, it's a concept, it's whatever we happen to think it is. And, we see it a lot again in our culture. My God is this, or I can't believe in a God that does this or that. And it's fill in the blank, whatever you happen to think. But in the end, we will have a God of our own making, or we will have no God at all. And even the God of our own making, we want to keep him away, except when I need him, except when and then I need that lifeline. I need to make sure that he can hear my prayers or whatever when I reach out to him. So, yeah, we're not carving little statues and falling down in front of them. We're not a part of that ancient Near Eastern cultural river, but the fundamental principle that led people to do those sorts of things in the ancient world, that fundamental human principle of independent and alienated existence from the true and living God, who is the definition of who we are, right, as image children. That fundamental human malady or problem continues to this day. It's ubiquitous in human existence in every time and every place. It doesn't matter where you live or what your religious cultural river happens to be or whatever. It's just the way we are as human beings in our natural state.
I mentioned last time to our listeners that as much time as we've spent building this hopefully robust, sturdy foundation, which we're going to really be leaning on and building from over the next couple of weeks, we won't be spending too much more time in the garden, the creation account, but we want to make sure people realize that everything going forward will be tethered to that too. As we kind of move out of the garden over the next couple of episodes to what is one thing you would like our audience, our listeners to really hold on to and to remember to really make sure that they stay anchored and tethered to the foundation that we've tried to establish these last 6-7 weeks?
Well, I suppose there are a lot of things that I could say because again, the whole scriptural storyline is building on this foundation. It's like you can have 100-story building with all kinds of details from floor to floor and whatever, but it all stands on that same foundation and depends on that same foundation. And that's the case here. But certainly, I think that a central issue from even the Bible's own vantage point of why it's so important to get this creation account and even Genesis 3 as in many ways the climax of the creation account, to get the first 3 chapters of Genesis firmly established in our mind in a correct way, is that if Jesus, the Messiah, comes to remedy the human plight, the creational plight, and to actually accomplish a remedy that will see the creation with the human race at the center, see the creation become what God intended it to be, then we have to know what God intended the creation to be. We have to know what God was intending and what the problem is, what actually happened, what is the calamity, in order to understand the person and the work of Jesus. If we don't, then we're going to interpret it in some other sort of way. And typically what people do is they say, okay, God has a standard. I haven't kept his standard. Jesus came to keep the standard. And then when I believe in him, then somehow that quote unquote righteousness gets put into my account. And now God is happy with me. And so now I know that my soul gets to go to heaven instead of go to hell when I die. And we don't even really understand what the person and the work of Christ are all about if we don't understand them in the light of, again, what we see the human vocation and the failure of that, because that's what Jesus came to address. So that the creation account becomes the foundation for understanding everything going forward, and certainly for understanding the person and the work of Jesus.
We sincerely hope this time you share with us has been profitable. Once again, don't forget to check out our website and subscribe to our YouTube podcast. And we look forward to you joining us for our next episode. For Kit, I'm Farhan, and we'll see you down the road.